It has been almost 3 years now that the Snowden leaks have massively changed, actually, our perception of mass surveillance and digital citizenships. And as there has been a lot of news coverage on this topic, there has also been a 18-month research project that digged deep into the implications of the Snowden leaks for policy, technology, civil society, and news media. And I'm now very glad to announce here Lina Dencik and Arne Hintz from Cardiff University.
Okay, hi, I'm Lina Dencik, and this is Arne Hintz, and we both work at Cardiff University in the UK, where we've spent the past sort of 18 months or so working on a project that's called DCSS Project, which we also have a website to find out more about it, dcssproject.net, where we've looked at the implications of mass surveillance for digital citizenship. And our starting point for this project is Edward Snowden and the Snowden leaks, first published in June 2013, that revealed the extensive and intrusive nature of contemporary forms of surveillance. That really implicate all of us as citizens, as they are rooted in our everyday communication platforms, so our phones, our social media activity, our browsing history, and so forth. And also, we are based in the UK, and we also decided to focus on the UK in this project, so that will be the kind of framework that we're talking about today. Also partly because of the central role that UK was revealed to have in this broader sort of surveillance regime. Even Snowden has said that the UK have done more extensive forms of surveillance than even the US has done. So what we did in our project, which is this project called Digital Citizenship and Surveillance Society, UK State Media Citizen Relations After the Snowden Leaks. This is a collaborative project, also with other colleagues at Cardiff University, as well as Oxford University and researchers in London. And we looked at the implications of the Snowden leaks in 4 different areas. So news media, civil society, policy, and technology. And what we'll do in this half hour, which is going to be pushed, is we're going to give you a brief snapshot of our research findings for each of these areas. So looking at the media coverage and looking at public knowledge and also impact on activists, looking at the legal and regulatory framework and which policy reforms we've seen, as well as infrastructures of surveillance, the role of standards and developments in anti-surveillance tools. And we wanted to think about this in terms of its implications for digital citizenship. We're looking at it in terms of digital citizenship because we want to recognize that our interactions with society as citizens are increasingly mediated through digital tools and platforms. And that's also been widely promoted in discourse around how digital technologies are providing us with new opportunities to participate and to deliberate and influence decisions that govern our lives. And for that to be meaningful, we need to therefore also somehow trust this infrastructure. It needs to be secure. We need to have some kind of policy framework in place that enables this form of citizenship, and also that allows us to enact citizenship, like being able to express ourselves freely or to practice dissent. And we need to understand how this infrastructure works, so we can interact with it in a way that's both informed and transparent. So what we wanted to look at is, what do the Snowden leaks and the aftermath of the Snowden leaks tell us about the state of digital citizenship in these terms? So if we start by looking at how this story has actually been covered in the media and how public knowledge around mass surveillance has been constructed, we looked at mainstream media. We also looked at blogs, and actually we saw some counter-narratives. But what I'll focus on here is the coverage of British mainstream press. And this is a timeline that we put together where we sampled all the stories relating to Snowden, GCHQ, and NSA. And this timeline, this is the number of stories, and then this is the timeline for it. But in order to narrow down the sample, we had to sort of focus on we decided to focus on particular pertinent events, both where there were peaks, as well as events that we felt had implications for some of the issues that we were interested in. So we looked at the initial Snowden revelations. We looked at the events or the revelations around embassy snooping and snooping on world leaders. We looked at the David Miranda case, David Miranda being the partner of Glenn Greenwald, one of the journalists who published the Snowden leaks, David Moran, who was detained at Heathrow under the Terrorist Act. We looked also at the case of Lee Rigby reports, which was a soldier who was killed in the UK, and a report came out arguing that Facebook should, the role of Facebook, or there was discussions around what the role of Facebook and social media companies should be in monitoring communications as a result of that. And then we also looked at the Charlie Hebdo aftermath. And this is what we found when we did our analysis. So Edward Snowden features in over 60% of the stories. And actually, he's clearly prominent, therefore, in the media coverage, and is generally covered using neutral or positive language, so things like whistleblower and leaker. However, what we see is that his revelations haven't really been regarded in the same way, and they haven't actually translated into significant media concern about breach of civil liberties, which was one of the aims of him revealing these documents. Because if we look at how surveillance is actually being contextualized in the media coverage, we looked here at the issues around surveillance. The prominent themes that are emerge again and again are themes to do with terrorism, themes to do with the role of security services, and UK-US government responses to the leaks. And this is really in contrast to alternative ways of framing debates around surveillance, on things like human rights, for example, or personal privacy, or freedom of the press, what we might think of as rights and citizen-based perspectives on surveillance debates. These don't really feature very much in the media coverage. And perhaps one of the explanations for this is when we look at the sources. If you look at the sources, we see that it is predominantly framed by politicians, by far the most dominant source in all the news coverage. This is actually pretty common when you do analysis of news media content. Often politicians get to frame many of the debates. But we would say also this has particular implications for how mass surveillance gets framed in the media, because it favors those types of perspectives and those types of opinions. And we see that also when we look at the actual opinions that are expressed by these sources. And we see that the most frequent opinion was that surveillance should be increased, or it's acceptable and necessary, followed by the opinion that the Snowden leaks have compromised the work of the intelligence services, and then also that social media companies should do more to fight terror. So when you look at this, you see that the overall pattern is that opinions surrounding individual liberties are not foregrounded and not presented as significant concerns. So just to sum up the media coverage of this, is that debates around surveillance are framed by elites rather than citizens. Consequences and the extent of mass surveillance of citizens are largely invisible. There's a dominance of discourse on state and corporate responsibilities for surveillance, framed around protecting national security and the link between surveillance and fighting terror. And therefore, we would argue media coverage contributes to justification for mass surveillance. Now, if we look at the civil society research, which is then the second aspect of this, we wanted to find out, okay, what is then public knowledge and attitudes to digital surveillance? What have been changes in digital communication practices or self-regulating behavior in response to the Snowden leaks? And what has been the impact of the Snowden leaks on activism and advocacy? And for this, we conducted focus groups with different members of the British public, getting a varied, different demographic groups, so according to ethnic background, according to socioeconomic status, according to age, according also to location in the UK. And then we also carried out interviews with political activists who are not involved in tech activist issues or digital rights issues specifically, but more broader sort of social justice issues like environmental activists, anti-war activists, labor activists, community activists, to get a sense of what these groups actually think about these issues. So what did we find? Well, in terms of the focus groups with the British public, we see that actually digital surveillance is not as prominent in people's understandings of what surveillance means as more physical forms or more obvious forms of surveillance like CCTV, for example. So data collection as such didn't really come up in people's minds necessarily initially when talking about surveillance. But with prompting, and when we started talking about these issues, it was clear that most people feel that the collection of data and even metadata, so distinguishing it also from content, constitutes surveillance. But there is a kind of low knowledge, really, of the Snowden leaks and also of Snowden himself. And there was actually quite a lot of confusion with Chelsea Manning and with WikiLeaks in people's knowledge of this, which I think is kind of indicative of how whistleblowers and security issues translate into public knowledge. And although it's difficult when people talk about this to isolate their concerns to a particular actor who conducts surveillance, so people often would talk sometimes about government surveillance, sometimes about corporate surveillance, sometimes about employer surveillance, sometimes about peer surveillance. These things kind of flow, or it's kind of fluid. It's difficult to isolate state surveillance per se as the main subject. There are definitely concerns in how people feel about this. People feel uneasy about it. People also feel that there is particularly a lack of transparency. They don't really understand how it works, what is being collected, and why it's being collected, and also what is the regulatory framework in place to try and actually regulate this. And also, there's concern with the lack of knowledge or transparency around how do you actually opt out or how do you circumvent some of these practices and how do you resist them. And that manifests itself, actually, it's interesting that there is an awareness around this, or there's an unease about it, but it manifests itself more in terms of people being a bit careful about not saying things that are too controversial or changing privacy settings a bit on their social media platforms and so forth, but not shifting to tools such as using encryption tools or anonymization tools. We saw very little, if any, of that being mentioned. And actually what also happens is that people tend to internalize these justifications that have dominated also media coverage, particularly around things like nothing to hide, nothing to fear, in order to sort of, perhaps, I suppose, be more comfortable with the situation. Again, I would say here that there was actually variation here in demographics. So when we did, for example, focus groups with young Muslims, which we did, they problematized this position around nothing to hide, nothing to fear, much more than other groups did. So this is obviously also related a bit to the position you have in society and how you feel more generally. But I think the argument we want to make, that what comes out of our focus group research, is particularly to distinguish here between, we're not talking about public consent to these practices, we're more talking about public resignation. So resigning to the fact that this is what goes on. And actually, some of these themes were also continued in our interviews with political activists, although we might expect these to be more resistant towards, or more vocal and outspoken about these issues. But actually, again, we saw understandings of surveillance are dominated by more visible forms of surveillance, particularly police infiltration, which is, has been very prominent in the UK on the activist scene. These were much more prominent in people's initial understandings of surveillance than things like digital surveillance. But actually also there was a general awareness that this goes on and a widespread expectation that these types of practices are being carried out, which is confirmed for them when their events are intercepted or where police turn up when they're there, when they've organized something and so forth. And so therefore, online behavior wasn't particularly linked directly to Snowden. So there wasn't that much of a direct response to changing communication practices as a response to Snowden, except for actually we did an interview with Greenpeace, who did actually particularly respond to Snowden and change their communication infrastructure. But predominantly, the Snowden leaks were unsurprising. This is what they were expected was going on. And also, there wasn't therefore much use of encryption, partly because it was seen as there's this question around convenience and so forth and technical ability, but also a rationale that using encrypted tools within an activist organization is somehow hidden, you're hiding your practices, or you're being exclusive. And this strides against activists' pursuits of transparency and openness. And this is also linked to the second point, where it was many of the people we spoke with sort of felt that, well, we're kind of too mainstream to have to worry about surveillance. We only really need to worry about that if we want to engage in more radical politics. So in some senses, we could see this as kind of keeping the mainstream in check, in that surveillance only becomes an issue if you do kind of radical politics, whatever that might mean. And for that reason also, concerning themselves with surveillance was kind of not seen as being part of their agenda. Rather, this is something that other people do, like tech activists or digital rights activists. This isn't what we do, so it's not an integrated activist practice as such, or an integrated activist concern, at least not in most of the interviews that we did. So just to summarize on the civil society stream, we've kind of said that we could think about this as identifying it as a particular kind of condition, which we've called surveillance realism, which draws on Mark Fisher's concept of capitalist realism, which he wrote in 2009 in the wake of the financial crisis, where he sort of saw that the prevalence of capitalism and the inability to articulate an alternative, even in light of radical failures, indicates a particular pervasive atmosphere. This is how he described it, that conditions also our thought and action. And perhaps similar to Fisher's characterization of social imagination in the wake of the financial crisis, if we look at these two first sections of our research, public debate and response and attitudes to mass surveillance in the wake of the Snowden leaks also kind of indicate a pervasive atmosphere that conditions our thought and action, where it becomes increasingly difficult to imagine an alternative to the existing system. Rather, we see the normalization of surveillance, that also it comes to advanced justifications that are then used to negate evidence of fallacies of the system, for example, invasions into privacy, civic rights, suppression, and discrimination. And then instead, citizens kind of continuously negotiate their activities, their views, their background, in relation to surveillance as a necessary everyday practice rather than questioning the system overall. And now, I'll hand over to Arne.
Thanks. So we heard about media coverage in civil society. There are two more strands, two more research areas that we looked at. One is policy, one is technology. Now, the evolution of digital citizenship, of course, depends also on the legal and regulatory framework. Policies created by governments and also internet businesses are crucial in either enabling or restricting the various activities of online citizens. And in the UK, the Snowden revelations led to institutional reviews of surveillance legislation, for example, by the Intelligence and Security Committee of Parliament, the ISC, or the Independent Surveillance Review of the Royal United Services Institute, RUSI, and also the Independent Reviewer of Terrorism Legislation, which led to the so-called Anderson Report. And these did not fundamentally oppose surveillance, but criticized the legal framework and demanded a more robust democratic debate and also democratic control, a democratic license, as the RUSI report called it, for the surveillance activities of intelligence agencies. And there were also legal challenges, mostly by civil society organizations, for example, before the European Court of Human Rights or the British Investigatory Powers Tribunal, that did not declare surveillance unlawful in its entirety, but pointed out parts of it that actually are unlawful. And so as a result, there is now new draft legislation developed and currently discussed in the UK, the Investigatory Powers Bill, which is to regulate a wide range of surveillance practices and basically puts it all into one law. Now, in our research, then, we talked with many different stakeholders and experts that participate in the policy debate, from GCHQ to the National Crime Agency to Google to Big Brother Watch to parliamentarians, all kinds of people. And these exposed substantial controversies over where to go with surveillance policy while the Investigatory Powers Bill was being discussed, including, just mentioning a few points here, the question of public debate and of the democratic license. Security agencies would, of course, typically say, well, it's enough now. The public should have just trust in the services and in the police. Digital rights groups, on the other hand, would say we really haven't had a proper debate yet, and also industry representatives would mostly say that, especially no serious review of what level of surveillance is needed and wanted by the public. The very definition of surveillance is contested. Most interviews would say that data collection as such is surveillance, but security agencies and some politicians, some industry representatives would say that it becomes surveillance only at the point of analysis. So when somebody reads the email, and they were focusing actually on humans interacting and analyzing data. Bulk collection of data has been a big area of controversy. Of course, Snowden also focused on it quite a bit in his revelations. Law enforcement would say it's necessary to investigate crime, civil society, but also well, and digital rights organizations, but also tech industry would mostly be opposed to that. Encryption, strangely enough, surprisingly perhaps, was the issue of least disagreement among the different interviewees that we talked with, even though at the same time we saw the Apple versus FBI case. But in the UK, it seems that law enforcement doesn't really want a wide public debate about this, and is perhaps also a bit concerned about the backlash, as we could see with WhatsApp going to end-to-end encryption and so on. Instead, state-sponsored hacking, or as it's also called, equipment interference or computer network exploitation, is what many of our interviews said the future. But there, especially, of course, bulk powers are particularly problematic. Inserting malware in software can affect thousands of users, and that's worrying, especially then in the context of the Internet of Things, of wearables, smart homes, smart cars. And unsurprisingly, the representative of law enforcement who we interviewed said, we're getting quite excited about the Internet of Things. And so there are very different value systems that underpin understandings of security, state security, or human security. And so whose voices are heard and who influences the policy debate most? It turns out security and intelligence agencies were involved in policy development right from the outset and were able to shape the new law in detail because they enjoyed the closest access to decision makers. Civil society and tech business were very vocal and contributed to public debate and consultations, and they have actually unanimously rejected the new law, more or less unanimously. But in fact, actually more or less every submission statement to consultations over this past year has been critical about the new proposed law, but these voices have not had much influence so far. So there is new legislation, a new legislative framework is being developed, but we don't see an actual revision of surveillance powers. Different levels of access to decision makers and specific institutional settings have led to unequal degrees of influence over policy reform and an imbalance in the voices and interests that are represented. The current national security discourse that prioritizes the state's role in protecting against physical harms over citizens' privacy and civil rights has provided the context for this imbalance. One of our interviewees said we need to flip the switch from state to citizen-centric thinking. Now, briefly on the final part of our research, we've seen from the Snowden leaks that the activity of security and surveillance agencies has gone far beyond the mere collection of data towards, as I said before, computer network exploitation, the weakening of security programs, of encryption systems. And so infrastructure as such has become a contested field. And so we were particularly interested in the standards bodies and the organizations that regulate standards and protocols, and thus the proper functioning of the infrastructure. Is surveillance being normalized through the infrastructure, or are there attempts to counteract surveillance? And in our research, well, at least the research team that looked at this interviewed participants in standards-making bodies and associated institutions, such as the Internet Engineering Task Force, IETF, or the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers, ICANN, or the American Standards Organization, NIST, or the World Wide Web Consortium, and others. And what we saw there, that yes, surveillance to some extent is enabled through standards. There our experiences how intelligence agency members participate in standards making, NSA people attend bodies like ISO, IETF, and so on. Sometimes they become vice chairs or chairs of working groups, and so on. The NSA also collaborated with NIST to weaken and undermine strong security standards. They created a backdoor in a NIST cryptographic standard. They proposed extensions to an IETF standard, and so on. And moreover, security agencies and large companies often push for the development of complex standards, which are then difficult to implement securely. But there have also been some interesting responses to the Snowden revelations, and also quite some shock among the standards community, I think. The IETF, for example, has declared pervasive monitoring as an attack. So this means there is a consensus there to mitigate this attack. It has become a new priority for the work of that institution. They've also established working groups to address the security of different protocols. Technical standards are designed to hinder mass surveillance. They're in development at the moment, for example, to expand encryption. Although they haven't actually addressed the issue of NSA participation in their working groups, so there are some issues there perhaps. Other organizations, like for example the Internet Research Task Force, IRTF, and ICANN have created working groups to explore how human rights protection can be more effectively incorporated into the protocols. The World Wide Web Consortium has intensified its work on tracking protection guidelines. Some other bodies, like, for example, the Global Certification Forum, apparently haven't really debated that so much. So there are different findings here. We could say overall that certainly standards are political. They're not just neutral tools. There is an increased urgency to incorporate privacy into standards. But there are also issues of structural unaccountability and complexity in standard setting. And it has been difficult, apparently so far, to change the role of security agencies in this process. And the question of who influences policymaking is certainly at the core of the issue here too, not just in national policy making, as we said before, but also in standards bodies. And at the very least, we think something needs to be done in terms of enhancing openness and transparency. Now to close, what does all this mean for digital citizenship? A lot can be said about that, of course, but just very briefly, if we think back at the requirements of digital citizenship that we brought up at the beginning, we can see there is a lack of knowledge. There is an insufficient public discourse that focuses often on security and terrorism rather than civic rights. There is now a more transparent law in the UK, in the making at least, but no overall review or revision of surveillance. There is also a struggle over the integrity and stability of the infrastructure. The Snowden leaks have crystallized the ways in which citizenship is moving towards a more monitored form, in which the relations between state and citizens are renegotiated. But our research actually shows two stories, perhaps. The first two parts, the media part and the civil society part, there we could see that surveillance really is justified and normalized to a large extent. In the other two parts, the policy aspects, the technology aspects, there is perhaps more tension, more struggle, but of course also there we see how difficult it is to challenge dominant interests. And despite all this, it also shows us some possibilities for change. There are loads, of course, but just from those few points that we mentioned so far here now in these past few minutes, we could see there is wider information through non-traditional media. That's the other part of the media research that we didn't really talk so much about. There are new alliances, for example, between digital rights organizations and tech business. There are efforts to incorporate human rights and technological standards, and so on and so on. So some things are certainly happening here. And yeah, these were just a few snapshots from our research. Thank you for listening, and please check our website. We will publish our research results on that website in the coming months, and you can already find a few things there. Thanks a lot.